However, I'm really excited about our speaker today. I'd like to introduce Eric Apfelbach, who I've known for 12 years. He's actually one of the reasons I came to Madison. He hired me at Virent, which was a startup company on the east side of Madison, spin out of UW-Madison. But before I tell you, I'm going to let him tell all the war stories about some of these previous experiences. But what's really interesting about Eric Apfelbach is that his career has been defined by early stage startups, hyper-growth companies, probably more than a couple turnarounds. And also it spanned a broad spectrum of industries, from semiconductors to LCD displays to lasers, biofuels, energy storage, and most recently software. So he spanned really the technologies that drive much of our economy. And so, in terms of this speaker series, we're having folks talk about their experience in innovating, and have someone like Eric who's innovated at small companies, large companies, hyper-growth companies, startup companies, public companies, private companies, is tremendous. So he's got a wealth of experience across a range of companies, both scale and type of entity. So I wanted to highlight a couple of some of his specific companies in his bio. So after he graduated Madison, he spent first part of his career in semiconductors, ultimately ended up at Applied Materials. And I thought it was interesting, in the 7 years that Eric was at Applied Materials, Applied grew from about $360 million to $3.6 billion. So I think that's a pretty exciting hyper-growth story. And not many of us have the opportunity to get that experience. So wanted to point that out in case anyone's thinking about it. I'd like to ask a question about somebody that's worked in a hyper-growth industry. He left that industry and came here back to Madison in 1995 to actually help turn around Planar, which was in LCD displays. And I think true to his roots in Wisconsin, he has stayed ever since. After Planar, he went and started a company out of UW-Madison, a laser company. After that company, he started another UW-Madison technology company called Virent, which is where I got to know Eric. After that, you went to, let's see, where did you go after that? You went to, the batteries, ZBB, right?
Yep, ZBB.
So joined ZBB in Menominee Falls. That was a different experience because that was a public company. So that was Eric's first time running a public company, maybe your last time running a public company.
Hopefully.
I don't know. So that's another interesting, to have somebody that's done early stage startups to actually running a public company is pretty interesting as well. And most recently, he's at PegX, which is a hazardous waste service and software company. So like I said, he's really spanned the full spectrum of size of companies, types of companies, and we're really looking forward to hearing some of the stories. I just realized I didn't introduce myself, but my name is Greg Keenan. I run the WARF Accelerator Program, and the Accelerator Program is a program where WARF is putting business resources and funding into pre-licensed technologies in our portfolio to help achieve a commercialization milestone, like a prototype, demonstration, field trial, any type of commercial milestone that will allow us to more effectively license technology either to an established company or to help start a company. So, I thank Eric for bringing me to Madison. He really sold me on coming to Madison and what Madison, could become. And I think it's fascinating. I think hopefully at the end when we have some questions, I'd love to get your perspective on, where Madison has come, since 1995 to now. It's pretty amazing. I think we're pretty hard on ourselves as a community. Sometimes we're not, we think we can always be doing better and we're not good enough. But when you go back to 1995 and compare it to now, it's pretty amazing. So Eric Apfelbach.
Thank you, Greg. Interesting story about Greg, actually. It's like our relationship was meant to be because I was literally trying to recruit the specialist person for Virent, and I needed a chemie with business acumen and savvy and experience in using hydrogen in industrial uses. And I'm thinking, where am I going to get a guy like that? So we hired a recruiter. They were scouring the globe. And I'm standing at a trade show, tons of people around. And the recruiter says to me, I've got just the guy for you. Do you know this guy, Greg Keenan? And at the time that the recruiter said this to me, I could have reached out and touched Greg's shoulder because I was standing in the Air Products booth where Greg worked. And it was, to me, that was just like, okay, this was meant to be. So yeah, we've never been happier. Greg was a stellar employee and key to one of the success stories I'll talk about. I wanted to share a few stories today and also a few kind of pearls of wisdom that I picked up along the way and then do a Q&A. But as I reflected on putting this presentation together, I started thinking, well, what are some of the cartoons and buzz phrases that I've used over and over again? And I always like this cartoon because I inevitably get in these conversations where somebody's coming up with this grand scheme. It's usually me or somebody, and it's like, this is stupid. Who would expect to do this sort of thing? And so I love this cartoon from the far side. But you know, the bottom line is entrepreneurialism requires that you kind of suspend your belief. I'm a chemical engineer, so I tend to think very analytically, but you have to suspend your belief and just start moving and start going after what your objective is. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is what I've seen in terms of, well, okay, if it's just blind faith, how do you guide yourself? Because doing a startup or any innovative process is like running full speed through a minefield. So you really do have to try to avoid the mines that are out there. One of the guys that I've met a few times and talked to is Vinod Khosla. He was a founder of Sun Microsystems, which hasn't existed for a while. But he's kind of a thought leader in Silicon Valley and has worked at a few name brand venture funds. And the concept behind all forecasts are wrong is really key in startups because so many of the things that people will tell you, the forecasts, you'll meet all kinds of people who actually think they can see into the future. It's amazing. It's like they know for sure what's going to happen. And I always like that Mark Twain quote where he says, "It ain't the things that you don't know that get you in trouble. It's the things you know for sure that just ain't so." And that is so true of startups because so many times you stop and you say, you know, do we have our head in, are we drinking our own Kool-Aid here? Do we really know what's going on? So I'll talk about that a little bit too. But first, you know, kind of some of the basics. There's hundreds of books you could read about startups and innovation and how to cross the chasm and you name it. I've read a lot of those, but it really comes down to a few key things. If any of you are involved right now in a startup or working with people who are trying to get this impossible task of starting a technology company done, you know, this is basically it. Greg's a good example of box number one, which is get the best people you can around you, whether it's mentors, neighbors, investors, board members. You just can't overemphasize this. And I've heard this 20 different ways, but I've experienced it in many different ways too, because the only way you're going to run through that minefield without stepping on one is to have all these people around you, the good ones. Make something that people want and solve their problems. Again, this is complicated. I'm going to go into a few tools for this next, but you wouldn't believe in this town in particular, there's all of this WARF technology, all these bleeding edge technical breakthroughs that happen that could be really great, but they may not be a business, they may not be a startup, they may never even be technically viable. And to be able to figure out what people really want, and if you can sell it to them at a price, is key. The last one, spend as little money as possible. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to finance companies, but the less money you can spend to figure out where you're going wrong, in essence, is the best, because you'll need those degrees of freedom to make it. But I want to tell a couple stories of how this played out in a few of the startups that I was involved in here in town. Some of the tools that support, that I've used over and over again to support what I just talked about, more specifically. as you start to dive into the unknown on any of these technology companies or turnarounds or struggling situations, you in essence are trying to solve a problem like I talked about, but usually that comes into some price performance metric that a real customer is going to write a real check for. And if you don't know what your techno-economic solution is and your competitors, and also have an educated guess where they're going to, you're probably flying blind, and you're asking to wake up one day and really be depressed with the results. Consult input from real customers, not consultants. I hope there's any consultants in the crowd. This is no offense, but real customers are just full of things that you don't even, when you go meet with them, you don't even know you're going to hear in terms about what the real need is, what the real price, what the real market priorities are. And so I can't encourage people enough to get out in front of the real buyers and decision makers. Open and honest communication with all levels of management. Again, this is something that everybody works on their whole career, because it's never easy to give somebody negative feedback or say things that could damage your company or the product that you're working on. So an honest culture is key. Use of gate reviews. We've done this in software and hardware. You need a disciplined process to develop any product to try to get into these markets. And then constant vigilance on external change. I'll use a few examples in here, but it is actually amazing. You've heard of people talk about black swans and other things. Those really do happen. You know, there's constant shifting around that you see that actually will require startups to pivot. And it's also amazing when you go and look at how many companies that are now, you know, quite successful in terms of profitability or IPO or whatever it is, how many of them did major pivots. Virent, the company that Greg came to town, we started out trying to make hydrogen for Honda. And one day we accidentally figured out we could make liquid fuels. And I say accidentally, it was basically accidentally. The same day we figured out we could make the precursors to PET plastics. On that day, you know, you could sell liquid fuels. You could not sell hydrogen for fuel cell cars. So we ripped up the business plan and went to liquid fuels. So there's that kind of external change happens. And then the cause and effect analysis. This I like to use across my whole life, but in startups, again, it's exceptionally important to sit down and say, do I really know the cause and effect diagram around value creation in this startup? And it's good to think almost like you're investors in this case, which is, well, if I do X and spend my money in this, will I get the result I want? Or am I just assuming some things here? And so there's a very good reason to do that. Greg did a great job going through my technology flow. What I call this my love-hate relationship with disruption. I love the fact, I got a ChemE degree, and then I love the fact that there's all of these things in the world in my career that have just changed so quickly. So I gravitate towards where you can take technology and completely change the way a prior business is done. That just is what excites me. It gets me out of bed in the morning. So I've gone from one thing to the other. Greg mentioned applied materials. During that period, we revolutionized, went up the Moore's Law, revolutionized semiconductor content within the world. Then I went into planar. We went from CRTs, if you remember what those are, and we had conversations like, oh, someday somebody might have a 19-inch flat panel display. And now you go to Foxconn days and it's, everything's $300 and it's 80 inches diagonal. It's just incredible. Then I went into Alphalite, and the engineering community of the world basically went from hardly any bandwidth on a glass fiber to 10 terabits per second. And in essence, worked themselves out of a job by performing so well on getting bandwidth on a glass fiber. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well, because we were in that market. That was another black swan. Virant, like I said, at the time we had 50% sugar water on one side of in a beaker, 18-inch stainless steel tube with some magic dust in it, and real gasoline and jet fuel coming out the other side. And Greg, I think, was there that day where we saw this, and it was like, it's close to a miracle, right? So we actually took that initial product, poured it in our lawnmower, and cut the lawn with it because we didn't know what it was. But it turns out it was half gasoline, half jet fuel. So we totally changed the way biofuels could be produced at that point in time. And then NSYNC, that company was microgrids and very large storage integrated with renewables. So we took power electronics, energy storage, so very large batteries, and microgrids and software, and we basically put out completely independent microgrids that could produce and store electricity and interact with the grid on a second-by-second basis. So you're going to see a lot more of that. You haven't seen it right now, though. So I love the disruption, but there is a dark side to it, and I'll talk about that in a second. So PEGX is what I'm working on now. So PEGX, I came in there actually, I do some turnaround work. I was pulled into PEGX as actually a turnaround CEO. It had some trouble. It was a waste broker. But when I got in there, all of the customers and all the people hauling waste in this country are getting fined and in trouble, and everything is dependent on the chemical traits of what they're hauling around. So the pricing, the logistics, the labeling, the safety, the spill response, you name it. Unless you know the chemical traits, you can't do anything. And all those chemical traits are in all these books all over the place. So we decided to take a modern cloud-based IT system and connect, using modern AI and machine language and software, all of the traits and all of the ramifications of those traits to all the decisions that normal humans have to make, and put that on a cell phone and on a desktop. So a lot of work, but nobody had done that before. So that's what PEGX is going after. We're about $8 million in revenue, 68% growth last year. So hopefully we're onto something. Let me go back to Alphalite though. This was my first venture-backed startup. And I left a fairly conventional LCD turnaround where we sold the company to Planar. And I wanted to stay in Madison. We started Alphalite. And I went to WARF, actually, down to the managing director of WARF. And I said, hey, what's cool going on in town for a guy with a lot of semiconductor background? And he waved in one of the licensing agents named John Hardiman. And he said, well, there's this guy trying to start a laser company. He's in the electrical engineering department. And turns out this guy's name was Dan Botez, and he was from Romania and an outstanding laser scientist. At this time, the entire bandwidth backbone of the US and the world was choked because nobody could figure out how to amplify optical signals. So Alphalite had a shot at a very high risk laser design. We went out to raise money, and I'd never done it before at that point. I had no idea what I was doing. When I think back to it, it's actually pretty funny. But so I went out, we raised some capital. Then the market really got overheated. So I kind of show here, this graph is a proxy for the optical components industry at that time. So we start Alphalite. We're in the MG&E Center. We go out, we start building a laser fab over by the airport. And we haven't even made a laser yet. And another venture group comes in and says, oh, we'll give you the term sheet for $75 million pre-money instead of the $10 million pre-money you were. And I guarantee, this is wild times. We haven't sold a thing. Companies started selling for $1 billion that had not made a thing in this period of time. So we watched this industry just go parabolic in terms of its valuations. It was totally insane. We were just starting to produce lasers over near the airport. And this is kind of fun from an engineering perspective if you don't have a technical background. Then somebody in England says, well, if we sprinkle a little erbium in this fiber, we can now put many wavelengths down a fiber, and we can amplify those light waves with lasers, and we can now increase the amount of bandwidth on every fiber. So what happens next is, like I said, that bandwidth goes from 10 gigabits per second to 10 terabits per second on every fiber across. It's already buried in the oceans and across the world. So this is what you see happen next. You know, the whole industry goes, oh, wait a minute here. All those forecasts we had, all of that, you know, what happens? I was in meetings at this time with WorldCom, and they were saying things like, what happens if somebody decides they want to email a colored digital photograph? And people are like, oh, system couldn't take that. And then somebody would say something like, what if somebody put color video on the internet? No, it'll never happen. This is 1999. I mean, this is not that long ago, right? So I came out of the semiconductor industry, so I see the industry, you know, kind of jump the shark here, and I'm thinking, well, this is just like the semiconductor industry. It's just cyclical. It goes up and down all the time. You know, we'll be fine. This is another cartoon I love, and I apologize if there are any mimes in the room, because the people, I have a dark sense of humor. You guys know me, right? So the people I know in Wall Street and other places use this cartoon all the time because it's like, you realize how strange it is in a startup, how out of the blue change can happen. And it's almost as crazy as this, because you basically are doing one thing and then the whole world changes. So you got to keep your eyes wide open, be willing to change, and form a culture that's adaptive. So we took Alpha Light, and at this point in time we said, you know what? This looks like more than just a minor cycle. So we took our high power optical laser company and we said, well, we're not only going to do telecom, but we're going to do medical, defense lasers, industrial lasers, you name it. And it's a good thing we did that, because this is what really happened. I title this slide, Whoops. The industry, in essence, invented itself out of existence. The need for high-power lasers and optical components went down for the foreseeable future in the fiber optics business, because you get free bandwidth everywhere right now, basically. So this was an example of where you just can't see it coming. One other story about this company that was interesting was when we raised our Series B round, I started into my presentation. I was one slide into my presentation, and the venture capitalist said to me, Eric, it was the market slide, right? He's like, Eric, don't talk to me about the market. You have no market risk. All your risk is product. And can you do the lasers? So we ended up getting telecom qual, which is a 30-year guarantee your laser won't change at all, which is very difficult. We ended up getting the product done, and the market absolutely went away. So this is a guy who's been in technology his whole life, and he gave us $20 million behind what he said. So he put his money where his mouth is, but the thing he said wasn't a risk was the only risk. And again, it's not fun to live through that, but it is what it is. And you know, this reminds me of the Chicago fire versus the Peshtigo fire. Most people don't know the Peshtigo fire was bigger than the Chicago fire and happened at the same time. Well, at the same time the dot-com bust was going on, you know, more than $1 trillion got wiped out in the telecom market, and it was way worse in terms of capital destruction than the dot-com bust. Now, Virant was interesting too, because we went into that with a lab scale benchtop hey, this seems to work. We can convert sugar water into hydrogen and gasoline and jet fuel and these plastics precursors. So now you got the hard work of, can you make this economically and can you make this scale? So we recruited Shell Oil. We already had Cargill as a feedstock supplier. We had Honda as an engine test company. We had then later Coca-Cola as a plastics partner. And the problem is not only did we not know what our break even would be, we were estimating it at about $70 a barrel of oil. But meanwhile, oil's going all over the place. So we're kind of like, oh, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. The first plant, if we wanted Shell to build the first plant, would have been $300 million probably for a full-scale production plant. So you can imagine for them to make that kind of commitment. And biofuels, more or less, right now, if you're not ethanol subsidized, it's a struggle, right? So Virent, I would say, and you guys know better than I do, is more into plastics now because you can get better money for a plant bottle logo with Coca-Cola than you can as a biofuel. NSYNC, this was really the disruption around, microgrids and renewable energies coming into the grid. So the entire grid is structured in a way so that it's stable. Coal plants, nuclear plants, all these things are just stable. All of a sudden you start throwing wind and solar on the grid, and when it gets to a certain percentage of that grid, you start getting instability. So you need energy storage, you need software, and you need a smart grid, basically. So that's what we are doing there. I had my experience in the semiconductor business. Early on when we were developing these microgrids, I had some analysts actually that worked for Warren Buffett. He was an investor in a lithium-ion battery company in China. And they wanted to figure out, well, I shouldn't say they wanted to figure it out. They came to me and they swore that battery development was going to follow the same rate of improvement that Moore's Law was. And Moore's Law, over here with semiconductors, you can see 300x improvement in 20 years. And Warren Buffett was throwing serious money behind this battery development, betting that it would do the similar things. And for any of you that know how a battery works, it's like comparing a horse to a zebra. Or worse, a horse to an alligator. It's a completely different thing. But the investors thought it would follow the same thing. So we had to base our entire business on what we really thought the rate of improvement of lithium-ion batteries would be. And it follows the track over there, which is 4x in 20 years. And if you looked at the last 3 years and went to Tesla and say, how much has my Tesla improved in mileage, energy density in the last 4 years, it would probably be like 1 or 2%. Because why? It's got to be safe, it's got to be cheap, it's got to be energy dense, and it's just not a simple problem. Not to mention, people tend to think in linear fashions. They connect the past and they kind of extrapolate in their brains, and it's like, well, oil got really expensive, so we want to shift over to electric cars. Well, obviously, if you shift the whole world to lithium, lithium might go up in price, right? There's actually shortages of cobalt. That's gone way up in price. So you start to deal with the same economics of the material side of the batteries you did in the oil world. So anyway, this is another example where we got involved in this, and luckily for us as a startup there, we had technology that I called the Cisco router of power. So we were able to route power independently and make money no matter what was happening. And that's why NSYNC is continued to do well. Now let me touch on a few key things that I touched on earlier, but I wanted to expand on a bit because it's so important. And I see a lot of startups struggle. I end up talking to a lot of startups on these subjects, and it's just, you can't overstate it. The people process. And I call it a process because it's never ending. I would tell you that you'll never get perfect at it, I've spent my whole career, every time I think I've learned everything, it's like, no, you learn another thing. You see another new thing. And so startups are a little bit unique because you may know what you want and be able to find the best person, but you may not be able to afford that person at that point in time, or you may not be able to get that person the resources or recruit that person. But at every stage, you've got to get the best people, and you've got to have the best practices for a hiring process. This took me years and many classes and practice to figure out that it's ready, aim, fire. It's get the job description, think about what that person has to do to define success for that job, go out and spend the time to find that person, and then help them, mentor them, get them to be effective. And establish the communication. Now this is a culture. I put a list of culture things here that continually come up in startups. And again, so important. And one of the reasons that I love doing startups, because you get the right people around the table. Nobody's afraid to walk into the CEO's office or anywhere else and say, you know, you're stupid, or that's a dumb idea, Eric, or whatever. And that's what really makes it work, because every startup I've seen has to have people in it that identify problems and then say, we got to pivot. We've got to change something here or we're going to die. And many of the startups, when you see them die, it's because they didn't pivot and the people in the organization weren't ready to go on that issue. I wanted to talk about the funding process. I don't know if you mentioned that. I think I've raised 16 rounds of debt and equity capital for around $275 million since Alphalite was my first time. And they're all different in many ways, but there's some common themes. And especially in Madison, where it's not as easy to raise capital as it would be on the coast. And we see that like crazy right now. But you've got to match the exact type of company, business model, and stage that you're in with the type of investors that you're looking for. And that takes some work. And again, getting people involved who have been there and done it before is really key, because some of this is kind of a sixth sense to see what these people have invested in or said no to in the past. So you've got to have that experience behind the business plan. Should you even go raise capital? Is it the right timing? Should you change something in your business model? And I will tell you one thing. I gained a huge amount of respect for investors after I started writing my own checks for startups. So if you really want to get empathy for an investor, go write some checks and then watch what happens to your attitude about investors. I would say that's a key thing. And so I've got some of our old investors here in the room. Learn how to tell a concise story that really defends that compelling investment thesis. This was hard for me too, because I'm an engineer. I thought the more technical knowledge I sprayed at these people, the better off I'd be. Certainly they'll understand the technical leverage that I've got here on my whatever, right? Well, it's just, when I became a public company CEO, people would say, okay, Eric, go in and dumb it down for this guy. And it would be like, you'd have to tell him what a solar panel was. And so I got much better at understanding you have to be able to tell the story in just such a simple fashion and concisely get them excited. They want a return on their investment. You have to explain to them why it's a compelling opportunity. Most investors have 10 other things they're looking at that are all interesting. Do dry runs with people. This is kind of blocking and tackling. Network to get warm introductions. This is really key. Most investors have groups of guys they trust. They have people they know well, and they know that they wouldn't introduce this person and this opportunity if they didn't think it was worthy of their time or a good opportunity. And so we always try to get a warm introduction. Somebody else will say, hey, you got to look at this thing. be ready for the obvious due diligence questions. There's a lot of things out there now that show due diligence lists and things that people want to know. When you go into a presentation, you want to already have all of that worked out and a rough cut idea of how you would answer that and some backup slides. And I've seen a lot of presentations where people ask basic market questions or things like that, and the entrepreneur's like, I don't really know, I'll get back to you. That's not a good way to start. So always be open and honest. I've had a lot of times out in Silicon Valley in particular, I'm a Wisconsin type of guy. I have no interest in exaggerating my story or saying I don't mind saying I don't know. So it was refreshing to them, and I had a lot of guys tell me, it was so refreshing to have you just basically tell us like it is and not be in exaggeration mode like a lot of the presentations. So you got to establish that trust with the investors. And then you got to run the process so everybody knows there's a finite amount of time and you got to get in, and you have to create some urgency. And this is always interesting because sometimes there is urgency. The one guy that I mentioned in our B round at AlphaLight, he literally on the second slide said to me, "You have a fiber optic packaging facility?" "Yes." And he said, "I'm in." Second slide, I think I was 8 to 10 seconds into this presentation for $20 million. And I was a smart ass back then, so I guess I still am, but I started closing my laptop, and I said to the guy, I have a policy that once I've sold something, I don't keep moving my mouth and buy it back. So, but I did tell the guy, hey, I will gladly give you the rest of the presentation, but you have to stay in. So he did stay in, and it is amazing when how crazy the funding environment can get that way, and anybody could raise money at that point. It's when it's a difficult time where you've got to run the process. And I always like this back to Vinod Khosla. He's an interesting guy, but in any of these startups, this phrase always resonated with me because you can't, so many of the things in Madison and other places, you literally, it's what makes it fun. It's why we get out of the bed in the morning. Doing startups is not easy, but it's so cool when you can wake up and think, I am going to take something that is going to change the way all kinds of people live their lives for a long time. And even if you're not the main driver in that, you're an important cog in the wheel. I actually like, it's funny the things we take for granted, but if you look at these things, we all have them. All of the companies I worked at, if you would have told a lot of people, 10 years ago that we'd have this kind of bandwidth, this kind of computing power, this resolution of a screen, this kind of storage, I think this has got 128 gigabits and a couple of SRAMs in it. And it would just cost like $600. People would have said you're crazy. Doesn't happen. But these cell phones are really the convergence of so many technology breakthroughs. It makes you wonder where we'll be in 5 years. But I guess my message is appreciate your cell phone for what it is, in terms of we just walk around like Star Trek now and just can do whatever we want. It's amazing. And so I love that process. I think it's why you're probably all here today, is all of you are probably involved in that process and have been parts of trying to change the world with technology. And every time, there was one quote I saw, from the late 1800s where the guy from the patent office said, everything that's worth patenting has already been patented, And every year you come forward and you see what's going on. I'm on the advisory board for the Grainger Institute, and I see a couple of my comrades back here. And we just had a board meeting, and I sat through that once again, just in awe of the technology application to real world problems that will revolutionize how we deal with disease, how we deal with everything, human health, you name it, cars, AI, and that's what's exciting. And so all these companies in town, any of you can support them, be involved, help them along. Madison's got an unbelievable ecosystem developing, and it's a little scary when you see it turn up as #1 on some of these lists for startups. I just saw that recently because it just means more traffic. But it's exciting time for this whole area. So with that, I think I'll take questions.
What recommendations would you have for wanting to actually do more of a non-for-profit, for something that's doing both grants and also needing investment towards mental health and things like that?
Yeah, probably not my wheelhouse in terms of, I give money to nonprofits, but I've never run one. But I think there's probably some analogs in what I said that's key. If you're literally trying to start one or get one going or grow it.
I'm working on doing a conference for teachers to deal with career burnout in Chicago, and it's going to be concentrating on the mental health of the teachers, but also create a database of the teachers to create a network.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different, but it's also, I have to create the technology so that so teachers can mentor each other easier too. So.
Right. Well, as most people know, everybody thinks nonprofit means you don't have to worry about money, but it's the opposite, right? You really have to worry about money because people have to give it to you, or you have to raise it somehow. So I think a lot of it's the same thing. Is you need a compelling story that you can tell the stakeholders that are either going to make donations or in the grant process, to write those grants in a way that, because they get way more proposals than they can possibly fund, right? So, the ability to tell that story in a compelling fashion and really grab people's interest, I would think would be your best bet. And if you can raise the money, that's the cause and effect chart, right? If you can do that and raise the money, then you'll be able to find the people to help, because it's a very good cause.
Thank you for a great presentation. Could you expand on the due diligence? You said
Due diligence.
papers. What are your advice for them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'd recommend. I've actually gone once in a while and looked for due diligence checklists online, because there's a lot of them out there. And that's one thing I'd recommend. Get a checklist from a venture site that just shows the things that are on their list. But the major ones that are in the early part of the deal stage are market-based. Like, have you segmented your market? Do you know the size? Do you know the served available market? Then there's usually some finance, the second level of finance questions, like, do you really know the cost? If you're manufacturing a product, do you have a shot at what it'll cost to build it, to scale it? Do you know your materials cost? So that's one thing. There's usually legal due diligence, which I wouldn't bother with right away. That's a different story, honestly. I've been involved in a lot of startups where the objective there is to stay clean. I always say you need to be able to pass a due diligence checklist. So if you don't have invention rights agreements in place for your employees, big problem, right? Guys will come in and say, well, how do I know you own it? Oh, I don't. That'll end a conversation quickly. So there's some checklist items that are good to just make sure your startup is clean, you've got all that stuff done. The other thing I would say is, some of the backgrounds on the people, also the technology due diligence that they'll do on patents. So if you're filing patents or have claims or things pending, you should know whether there's been office actions, and you've done a rough cut offensive and defensive patent map to the degree possible, and that those things all convince the investor that, okay, you're able to protect my investment if I put my money in.
You really got to the heart of one of the questions that I was going to ask you. So I guess I would ask what advice you'd give to an entrepreneur in the tech space who's putting together their 2019 calendar in the way of amalgamating products and services while also conducting research and development. Perhaps enter into the intellectual property patent phase of their enterprise.
Yeah, and if you're involved in research and you think you're going to end up with patentable claims, and I'm assuming this would go through WARF probably, or if not, that's fine too. I mean, basically, with regard to that part of the IP process, we have hand-selected our attorneys, our IP attorneys, from anywhere around the country. We didn't really care where they physically sat. And we found the one that had the most domain experience. It was exactly in the research that we were doing. Because the way those claims are written around your research and the questions, a good IP attorney will ask you a lot of guiding questions while you're doing your research. And they may ask you things that will drastically improve your research and the answers and data that you have. So if you're in that phase of still doing the research, I'd recommend early engagement with a really targeted IP attorney. And then after that, patents are difficult because it's a game where they'll take as much money as you want to put into it. So you have to be very strategic and look for, get an attorney who knows how to use patents as a blocking mechanism and how to do a little bit of mapping. And it's always a budgetary question. These guys are not cheap, right? It's $400 an hour for a good patent attorney. The other thing you can do is work with some people who are maybe along the lines of patent clerks, who are lower dollar and have done work in that space before. Excuse me. Because, yeah, the problem with patents I've always had is it's expensive. And if you're launch of your startup, you're not going to have a lot of dry powder. That's what's nice about WARF, actually, is that you can get much of that done. And I think Eric Iverson and the group down at WARF has done a really good job improving the amount of helpful patent work that an early stage researcher can get while they're in that phase.
Can you share a few of examples of your defining moments that shaped you as a leader?
Oh. That's a great question. There's a lot of moments of truth, is what we kind of call them, and they're moments that you don't wish to be in, and they're usually not pleasant. That's, you've heard those quotes about, your character isn't revealed; it's revealed and developed by adversity. But so there's a lot of adversity in startups, short term and long term, and some of the defining moments. I would say that some of the times when we were in meetings and it became clear. Now, I'm fortunate actually that I have never run a company out of money. I've come darn close. In fact, I'll tell you a little side story. I was at NSYNC, was a turnaround public company in high tech, and it was a real mess. And it was one of these deals where I got in there, started working, and in hindsight, I never would do it again, right? But it was too late. I'm a CEO of a public company. I've got to do it. There's rules around raising money in the public markets, and I had done everything I could. We were out of options. The company literally, I was sitting there saying, I don't have any other options. I don't know what I'm going to do because you can only raise so much as 1/3 of your public float. And we had already done that. And it was like, time's up. I had already retained a bankruptcy attorney. Again, because it's public, you don't want to fool with that. Well, then Jim Doyle calls me. I had talked to Jim Doyle, the governor at that time, and said, hey, I saw President Obama was coming to Milwaukee, and if he needs a renewable energy company to come to, we're ready and willing to take the visit. So Jim Doyle calls me and says, Eric, the White House is about to call you. Don't hang up. It's not a joke. And so I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I hang up the phone. 2 seconds later, probably, the White House calls me. Long story short, Obama comes to visit us. We host his visit. And when the stock market heard that Obama was coming to our facility, our stock went up about 70% one day, right? Because everybody thought he's going to rain money on us, right? Which was not the case. Well, anyway, that one day that Obama was there, that reset our public float, and we were able to go raise money off of our shelf. Without the president calling me, company would have probably hit the fan at full speed. So there's a lot of moments like that. I could probably go through 10 where sheer perseverance and the absolute, I'm not going to die till somebody carries me out on a slab. That sort of mentality, when you do it over and over again and somehow you live, I tell a lot of people, no matter what happens, I don't care. Unless they carry you out, you're probably going to make it, and it's going to be painful, and you're not going to have fun, but you'll come out of it. And these days, I've had actually, Greg, I'm not even going to talk about the specifics, but we had an event at Virant where Greg looked at me and he was like, Eric, I don't understand. How can you be so calm in this situation? Actually, there were 2 that Greg was responsible for. But I'm like, it's the only thing you can do. You got to focus on what I control, what I'm going to go get done, and then get it done to the best of your ability. And if it doesn't work out, it's a bummer. But so far, every time I've been in that situation where I thought I was going to die, somehow we pulled it out. And so that's really the thing, is just stick at it no matter what.
Eric, question. I imagine there's a few people out here that are either part of a young company or have a new technology. So you have been introduced to a lot of opportunities in your past, some turnaround, some in really exciting spaces. And I think it might be interesting to hear, when you get introduced to an opportunity, if someone's interested in getting a seasoned startup person, what is your evaluation process, and what do you look at to try to make a determination on whether you're going to spend time on that opportunity?
Of the opportunity or the person?
On the opportunity.
Oh, on the opportunity. Boy, that's a great question. And there's, number one is get people with that sixth sense that have been in the end market before. To the degree possible, if you've got a product, you know where the end market and end customer is going to be. And usually there's people that have operated in that market and know the strengths and minuses and what really happens. It's so easy in any early stage technology. We used to talk about this actually at Virant. When we'd look at a new application, we'd always say, well, everything looks good when you don't know anything. We're all optimistic entrepreneurs. Of course it looks great. So, I always start with the compelling market opportunity. And is it really a product that can sell and compete? Can you get it to market in a reasonable amount of time? Over my life, Alpha Light, we spent $20 million on a semiconductor grade laser facility before we could make a product. Virant, the CapEx was very high, so now I'm in software, and part of the reason for that is you don't have any big CapEx or long cycle to get into it. So some of these things you look at from a product opportunity, like, can I change the world with this product? And I don't care that it takes a long time and a lot of capital. Other ones, it may be, I'm more of an investor, plus I'm 57 now, so I don't have as many turns at bat left in me anymore. But I look now at a lot of capital efficiency things too, like, how much money does it take to get to each milestone and de-risk a technology? Because most of these things are very, have various types of risk profiles to them. So But I would start with those two things and see, are there definable milestones on that techno-economic model that I can get to with a decent amount of money that I can raise, and then if I get there, is it a financeable event, and is the market worth that? You know, there's some markets that are just not compelling enough or big enough or fast enough growth. And I've seen a few companies go and finance something like it's going to be a venture capital investment, but the markets aren't big enough to support an actual venture capital investment. And then you're out on a dark alley, because now you've grown a company, you've done some things, they're good, but you can't get to the next phase because it's not a big enough opportunity. Venture capital, as you guys know, is a very different animal from angel funding and friends and family and that sort of thing. Hopefully that answered your question.
I would be grateful if you elaborate more on the VRENT. Coca-Cola funding. I wanted to know what problems or perhaps what obstacles VRENT confronted pertaining to getting funded.
Good, yeah, good. Virent was an interesting company because we had, on one hand, we had kind of an embarrassment of riches. We had come up with a way to make everything from LPG to liquid fuels to, jet fuel, gasoline, diesel. One of the thing with Coca-Cola was fascinating because we had one of our board members who was from BP Plastics. Deep expertise, PhD from Harvard, I think. Deep expertise in the real chemical industry. And this kind of goes to what I said about getting the guys who know that industry. He basically came to us and said, listen, if you make that sugar into fuel, people will pay, let's say $1 per carbon, right, just as a baseline. If you make that into something that enables Coca-Cola to improve the brand, the plant bottle logo on their bottle, then it's probably worth 3 times that. And it's not because of it's just because of what a brand is worth versus what people are willing to pay for a biofuel. People want to be green, but if you go up to the pump with a biofuel and a not biofuel, they probably won't pay more than a couple cents extra for the biofuel. It's an unfortunate reality, right? So when you see the oil prices do what we did, right, the company had to hedge in essence. Coca-Cola was in a war. If you can imagine Coca-Cola, they are the most brand-oriented company in the world, I think, right? There's nobody that is that intense on their branding. The PET plastic bottle, when they show rafts of them floating in the ocean with Coke labels on them and things like that, that is the opposite of what Coca-Cola wants. So they came up with this plant bottle. The ironic thing about the plant bottle was that it doesn't degrade any faster than regular PET plastic. And it's made out of sugar, but it doesn't degrade in the ocean. It floats around just like the oil-based plant bottles rather. So it was all branding, but it opened up the value chain for our process by 3x in terms of ability to make a profit on the process. And so when fuel, the price of fuel, I think, hit $40 per barrel, deep under where it would have had to be to make Virent's process profitable on fuels, the company elected to take Coca-Cola up on their offer to fund the plant bottle effort. And I like I said, I think it's still one of the primary efforts. But it was, economic driven, somewhat survival. And the way, much like how Tesla sells cars and gets big credits for the fact that they're offsetting, they're basically, offsetting the renewable petroleum, there's credits available for biofuels, and some big companies just need those credits. So biofuels end up in the same bucket right now. Unless you get, like ethanol gets a lot of support through taxes. So yeah, that's how that Coca-Cola thing came up, and that's why it worked well.
Any other questions? I'm going to finish with, I guess, two, so really quickly. You've been in the starting companies in Madison since 1995 or thereabouts. What has been the biggest change here in Madison over those years? What is the one or two things that continue to hold us back from reaching our full potential?
Yeah, it's obviously everything's headed in the right direction. I think when I started, and it was actually 99 when I started Alphalite, and we had one venture capitalist, really venture investors in town. That was really it, and they were fairly small and not that experienced in some of the technologies like what Alphalite was doing. We had, but now if you look in town, I don't even know how many pools of capital there are accessible locally here, but it's got to be 10, I would think, something like that. So that's really good to have different people. It's allowed some of them to focus on different technologies. The ecosystem for all of the attorneys, accountants, consulting, ex-entrepreneurs has gotten huge. It has a long way to go, but I think it's I think that's really good. I think the thing that we really need is some big exits. We in Wisconsin, it's amazing, right? I was just reading Forbes. The two top self-made billionaire women in the North America are both Wisconsins. One's ABC Roofing, one's Epic, right? These are unbelievably great companies, but there were no exits. Nobody got rich. If you look in Silicon Valley, the best thing that happens is when you make 1,000 people into millionaires and billionaires, when one of these big companies goes public or sells, is that they all fan out and do it again. Unfortunately, Virent and Alphalite did not have big exits. We sold those for, both those sold for less than the preferred valuation, I believe, or right at about that valuation. So I didn't contribute to that either. But but yeah, hopefully the city will see some big exits, and the funnel of startups now that's coming through, I think you'll see a lot of, I think you definitely will see it. It's a probability game, and there's a lot of great companies, so that will happen.
So that wraps up our session. So Eric, first I want to thank you for speaking today. And I have to mention, I appreciate, Eric's been a great friend of mine for 12 years. He's been a mentor. And I think I really appreciate the fact that you've chose to stay in Madison to apply your craft and continue to help advance entrepreneurs, both as inside companies as an investor. So certainly appreciate the contributions that you've made to the city, to the university. I think it's tremendous. So thank you, and thank you for speaking. Greg. And we'll have a reception out back, and we can tell you actually some of the real stories then.
Yeah, right. Get the real stories. Let Greg tell them. He's a member and he's a party to some of the stories. All right. Thanks, everybody.